Hello and welcome. This one's a little different. I didn't see too much on this subject here on YouTube. The topic is psychic signifiers. This video will cover the why, the design philosophy / logic behind signifiers, and a brief tutorial on how I made mine. So without further ado, let's take a look at psychic signifiers. Often in games of 40k, your dudes will have psychic powers with lasting effects, and typically players will place down something near the target of the power to serve as a reminder, most commonly a data card. But rather than placing a card on the table, I find a custom signifier does the job much more elegantly. It serves as a reminder and describes what the power is, all while being less invasive on the tabletop, which helps keep that immersion and the spectacle of war intact. Another reason is that it's a pretty fun challenge to come up with ways to describe the psychic powers. It's a conversion project, which can make use of those extra bits we all have that have been waiting for a purpose. And, positioned towards a creative demographic, us hobbyists, it feels like a natural pairing. So with the whys now explained, I suppose it's best to shift over to the design philosophy. When I was setting out to make these signifiers, I identified two design philosophies that could be taken. The first is what I would refer to as iconographic, which is the process of using symbols and images to describe or represent a subject, which is what I have done here with my batch of Space Marine Librarius power signifiers. The Hourglass for Veil of Time, the Mark III Gear for Might of Heroes, the Bound Reliquary for Null Zone, and the Tower Shield for Psychic Fortress. The other design philosophy would be to take a more literal approach with regards to the representation. The easiest examples of this would be the endless spells from Age of Sigmar. Both have their pros and cons. The literal approach is undeniably more immersive, but it's much harder to execute, and it may be harder to keep them to a smaller or consistent size, especially so for some of those more abstract psychic powers. It's for those reasons I went with the iconographic route, as it checks all the boxes that I prefer. Now onto the build method I used and the rationale behind it. As you can see with the ones I have done, there were several design decisions I made which all refer to the aesthetic objective I had. The goal I had in mind was to create signifiers which emulate the aesthetic of static effect signifiers used in Heroes of the Storm and similar type games. That glowing icon that describes an effect and is directed for player readability. To start, the models were glued together or pinned where necessary, and were positioned at an angle for optimal player readability. Then they were pinned onto their bases slightly off the ground, to give more of that floaty feel. On the topic of bases, since units in 40k use round bases, I opted for square ones, and I oriented them on their point to create a diamond-style backdrop for these icons. Then I based them in the style of my army, and trimmed them with an atypical color, all of which aid in the goal of being easily and quickly discernible on the tabletop. And most obviously, the paint scheme. The method I used was very similar to that old Lava Armies tutorial Duncan Rhodes did for Warhammer TV. That process seemed to me as a simple but effective way to evoke the glowy nature of the aesthetic goal. But rather than using the warm colors in that video, I opted for cooler blues, which to me feel like a great fit for the Librarius discipline. Changing the colors doesn't change the process. You start with the Wraithbone base, and then gradually dry brush your colors going from your lightest value to your darkest. I suggest choosing a hue that most suits your psychic discipline, or one that contrasts your army's color scheme. You may have noticed that I finished the base work first. This is because when I build up the hues, I can overbrush onto the ground, with the goal being to create some subtle bounce light to help sell the glowy nature of these signifiers. The last step is to clean up the pin. I'm using black primer here, followed up by painting the base's rim, which for my scheme I'm using Kaldor Sky. So I lied, here's a bonus step. I didn't like how intense the dark values were on this one, so I'm applying some Wraithbone with a bit of Baroth blue mixed in. I'm applying it very delicately to lighten up the values a bit. And that's a wrap on this one. Thanks for watching. Also, a special thanks to my patrons who help keep the dream alive. These were my thoughts and approach towards creating signifiers. And while this video's topic is psychic signifiers, the principles and methodology described does apply to the concept of signifiers in the general sense. So in the spirit of helping each other build psychic signifiers, if you have any concepts for how to convert signifiers for psychic powers, I invite you to share them in the comments below. So, if you enjoyed this video, there's a like button. And if you want to help my channel grow, there is a subscribe button. There's also a bell button and a share button, so press the buttons you want to press. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. That's great.
That's great.